The doors to Buckingham Palace opened just minutes ago, and what emerged has sent shockwaves through every European capital. King Charles has made a move so bold, so constitutionally unprecedented, that Brussels is in emergency session trying to comprehend what just happened. But here's what makes this absolutely explosive. While the King was making decisions that will reshape Britain's relationship with Europe, Keir Starmer was simultaneously having a complete meltdown in an emergency meeting with Nigel Farage that witnesses describe as the most chaotic confrontation in modern political history. The timing isn't coincidental. These events are connected in ways that reveal a coordinated effort to fundamentally redirect Britain's future. What we're about to reveal will prove that the political establishment's grip on power is being challenged from the highest level, and the European Union's plans for Britain are being destroyed in real time. The emergency summons that brought Nigel Farage to Downing Street arrived at 7:15 this morning through unofficial channels that bypassed normal governmental protocols. The message was cryptic but urgent, requesting Farage's immediate presence for discussions of national importance. For Starmer to be calling him Farage, his political nemesis and the man who'd orchestrated multiple crises that had devastated the government, indicated desperation at the highest levels. Farage arrived at the back entrance of number 10 at 8:30 a.m, avoiding the main media presence, but still being photographed by alert journalists who'd been tipped off that something significant was happening. His expression as he entered was confident, almost amused, like a man who knows he holds all the cards walking into a negotiation with someone who has none. The meeting was scheduled to be brief, perhaps 30 minutes of discussion about how to manage the ongoing political crisis. It lasted nearly 3 hours and ended with Starmer visibly shaken and Farage looking triumphant. What happened inside that meeting has been pieced together from multiple sources who were present or briefed immediately afterward. And it paints a picture of a Prime Minister who's completely lost control. Starmer began by attempting to negotiate some kind of political truce, offering Farage concessions on immigration policy and suggesting there might be a path to including Reform UK perspectives in government decision-making. The desperation was obvious and pathetic, according to those present. Starmer was essentially begging his political opponent to stop destroying him, offering policy reversals and political positions in exchange for mercy. Farage's response was brutally direct. He told Starmer that the time for negotiation had passed, that the government had lost all credibility and authority, and that nothing short of complete policy reversal on multiple fronts could possibly salvage the situation. He laid out demands that were essentially impossible for Starmer to accept without completely abandoning everything Labour stood for. The specific demands Farage made reveal his strategy and the depth of Starmer's weakness. First, immediate halt to all cooperation with EU regulatory alignment and formal renunciation of the secret deal that had been exposed by the Supreme Court. Second, implementation of strict immigration controls, including the policies that Starmer had spent years opposing as inhumane and racist. Third, a public apology for the government's handling of Brexit, an acknowledgement that the Leave voters were right about sovereignty and democratic accountability. Fourth, and most stunning, Farage demanded that Starmer personally recommend to the King that a cross-party commission be established to review Britain's constitutional arrangements, including the role of Parliament versus executive power. These weren't negotiating positions designed to reach compromise. They were ultimatums designed to be rejected so that Farage could claim he'd tried to help, but that Starmer was too ideologically rigid to accept common sense solutions. Starmer's reaction to these demands was where the meeting descended into what witnesses describe as a meltdown. He reportedly raised his voice, something extremely out of character for the controlled former prosecutor, and accused Farage of trying to destroy British democracy through populist demagoguery. He listed Reform UK's various provocations, the migrant busing operation, the coordination with Conservative rebels, the constant media attacks, and accused Farage of caring more about political power than about the country's well-being. Farage's response was calm and devastating. He pointed out that everything reform had done was simply forcing progressive politicians to live with the consequences of their own stated policies, and that if those policies looked bad when actually implemented, perhaps the policies were the problem, not the people exposing them. The exchange became increasingly heated, with aides on both sides trying to calm their principals. The breaking point came when Starmer apparently made a desperate threat. According to sources, he told Farage that continued political warfare would damage Britain irreparably, and that if Farage didn't back off, Starmer would use every lever of government power to investigate Reform UK's financing, operations and associations. It was a threat to weaponise state power against political opponents, the kind of authoritarian impulse that would have horrified Starmer in different circumstances, but that his desperation had driven him to. Farage's response was to stand up, look Starmer directly in the eye and tell him that such threats only proved that the government had to be removed from power as quickly as possible. He warned that any attempts to misuse government power would be exposed and would accelerate the government's collapse. Then he walked out, leaving Starmer sitting alone in the cabinet room with his aides, trying to process what had just happened. While this confrontation was unfolding in Downing Street, King Charles was at Buckingham Palace making decisions that would fundamentally alter Britain's relationship with the European Union. The King had requested briefings from Foreign Office officials, constitutional advisors and legal experts about Britain's current obligations to EU institutions and the extent of regulatory alignment that existed despite Brexit. What he learned apparently convinced him that the British government had been systematically undermining the Brexit referendum result through administrative and regulatory cooperation that bypassed parliamentary oversight. The briefing showed that while Britain had technically left the EU, the practical reality was continued deep integration on multiple policy areas that most voters and even most MPs didn't understand. Charles concluded that this represented a constitutional crisis where the executive branch was subverting the expressed will of the people. The King's response was to exercise royal prerogatives that haven't been used in modern times, inserting himself directly into questions of foreign policy and international relations in ways that alarmed constitutional experts, but that he judged necessary given the circumstances. He sent formal communications to European leaders, not through normal governmental channels, but through royal-to-royal contacts and direct diplomatic channels that bypass ministers. These communications made clear that from the King's perspective, Britain's relationship with the EU needed to be fundamentally reassessed, and that regulatory alignment arrangements made without proper democratic oversight lacked legitimacy. The language was diplomatic, but the message was unmistakable. The British monarchy was asserting that the government's EU policy lacked democratic mandate and constitutional authority. The European Union's reaction to receiving communications from the British King, rather than from the government, was initial confusion, followed by alarm and then anger. Brussels operates on the assumption that it deals with elected governments, not with monarchs who aren't accountable to voters. The constitutional implications were bizarre and unprecedented. What authority did the King have to communicate about policy matters? How should EU institutions respond to royal messages that contradicted government positions? Was this a constitutional coup or a legitimate exercise of reserve powers? European Commission officials were on emergency calls with legal advisors, trying to understand what was happening and how to respond. Several European heads of government reached out directly to Starmer, demanding to know what was going on and whether the King was acting with government approval or in opposition to it. Starmer's position became impossible when news of the King's communications leaked to media, while he was still dealing with the aftermath of the Farage meeting. He was being attacked from all sides simultaneously. Farage and Reform UK were celebrating the King's intervention as vindicating everything they'd been saying about the government's illegitimate EU entanglements. Conservative opposition was demanding emergency parliamentary sessions to discuss the constitutional crisis. European leaders were expressing no confidence in the British government's ability to manage its own affairs. And now the monarch himself was publicly undercutting government policy in ways that suggested either the King had gone rogue or the government had lost royal confidence. Either interpretation was catastrophic for a Prime Minister whose authority was already in tatters. The constitutional experts were divided debated on whether the king's actions were appropriate or represented dangerous overreach. Some argued that the monarch has residual constitutional responsibilities that include ensuring government operates within democratic mandate and constitutional limits, and that Charles was legitimately raising concerns about whether the executive branch had exceeded its authority. Others argued that the king's intervention was inappropriate regardless of the merits, that constitutional monarchs don't publicly contradict or undermine elected governments, and that Charles was destroying the delicate balance that makes the British constitutional system work. The debate reflected deeper questions about how Britain's unwritten constitution functions when normal political mechanisms fail and when government and monarch disagree fundamentally about constitutional propriety. The timing of these simultaneous crises, the Farage confrontation and the King's EU communications, suggested coordination that multiple observers found suspicious. Had Charles and Farage discussed strategy? Were they working together to bring down Starmer's government? The evidence was circumstantial, but the coincidence was remarkable. Both men had grievances with the current government and both stood to benefit from its collapse, whether through direct coordination or simply parallel thinking. Their actions were mutually reinforcing and creating a pincer movement that was crushing Starmer between populist political pressure and constitutional royal intervention. The government that had already been weakened by scandals and policy failures was now facing an existential threat from the highest and the most populist elements of British political culture simultaneously. The European Union's emergency response revealed the extent to which Brussels had been counting on the Starmer government to gradually bring Britain back into EU regulatory and political orbit. Internal EU documents that leaked in the aftermath showed extensive planning for deepening UK-EU integration through technical cooperation and regulatory alignment that would be implemented gradually without requiring the political approval that a formal rejoin process would demand. The strategy was to make Brexit meaningless in practical terms, while technically respecting the referendum result, achieving through administrative processes what couldn't be achieved through democratic politics. King Charles's intervention threatened to expose and derail this entire strategy, forcing everything into the open where it would face political and public scrutiny that EU officials had been hoping to avoid. The specific policy areas where the EU had been coordinating with the British government included financial services regulation, environmental standards, product safety requirements, and data protection and rules. In each area, British regulators and their EU counterparts had been working to maintain alignment or even deepen integration under the radar of political oversight. The justification was always practical, arguing that businesses needed consistent standards and that cooperation made sense, regardless of political Brexit debates. But the cumulative effect was to maintain British subordination to EU rulemaking in vast swaths of the economy without any of the voting rights or influence that EU membership would have provided. It was the worst of all possible arrangements. And the King's intervention was highlighting exactly how undemocratic and constitutionally dubious the entire structure had become. The political calculation facing Starmer was impossible. If he defended the regulatory alignment and EU cooperation, he'd be admitting that he'd been undermining Brexit and deceiving voters about Britain's independence. If he abandoned the EU cooperation to appease critics, he'd be reversing policies that much of his party and base supported and would face rebellion from pro-EU Labour MPs. If he challenged the King's right to intervene in policy matters, he'd be triggering another constitutional crisis on top of the ones already consuming his government. If he accepted the King's position, he'd be acknowledging that his government had been operating outside constitutional bounds. Every option led to political disaster, and Starmer's paralysis in the face of these choices was itself becoming a story about leadership failure and government dysfunction. The public reaction to the King's intervention was sharply divided along predictable but also some surprising lines. Brexit supporters were jubilant, seeing Charles as defending the referendum result against elite attempts to reverse it through administrative means. They praised the King's courage in standing up to both the government and the EU establishment. Remain supporters were horrified, viewing the King's actions as anti-democratic interference that threatened to damage Britain's relationship with its largest trading partner. But interestingly, there was also a significant group of voters who'd supported Remain, but who also supported the King's intervention because they valued democratic accountability over policy outcomes. These voters felt that if Britain was going to reverse Brexit or align with the EU, it should be done openly through democratic processes, not through backroom regulatory cooperation. The King's intervention was forcing honest debate about issues that political elites had been hoping to handle quietly. The media coverage was intense and multifaceted, with different outlets pushing competing narratives about what was really happening. Right-wing tabloids portrayed Charles as a hero defending British sovereignty against bureaucratic betrayal. Left-wing broadsheets expressed alarm about constitutional monarchy interfering in democratic governance. Business publications focused on the economic uncertainty created by the political chaos and the unclear future of UK-EU relations. International media portrayed Britain as descending further into political dysfunction, with constitutional crisis piled on top of governmental collapse. The diversity of coverage reflected genuine uncertainty about how to interpret events that had no clear precedent in modern British history. The Farage factor in all of this was significant because he represented the populist political energy that was reshaping British politics and that traditional parties hadn't figured out how to contain or co-opt. His meeting with Starmer and his public statements afterward positioned him as the alternative to a failed establishment. He was arguing that both major parties were part of the problem, that both Labour and Conservatives had betrayed Brexit and democratic accountability, and that only Reform UK represented genuine change. Whether this message would translate into electoral success remained unclear, but the political space for a populist insurgency had never been larger. The traditional party's weaknesses were creating opportunities for political entrepreneurs like Farage to fundamentally reshape the political landscape. The constitutional implications of the King asserting himself on policy matters extended beyond the immediate EU question to broader issues about the balance of power in British governance. If the monarch could intervene on EU relations, could he also intervene on other policy areas where he believed the government was exceeding its mandate or violating constitutional principles? What were the limits on royal prerogative in an era where conventions were being shattered regularly? Different constitutional experts gave wildly different answers to these questions, reflecting the fact that Britain's unwritten constitution depends heavily on precedent and convention, and unprecedented situations create genuine uncertainty about what's constitutional and what isn't. The economic consequences of this multi-front political crisis were mounting daily. Business investment was frozen as companies waited to see what government would emerge and what policies would be pursued. International corporations were delaying decisions about British operations pending political clarity. The financial markets were punishing British assets, with the pound falling and gilt yields rising as investors demanded higher returns for political risk. The economic cost of political dysfunction was substantial and growing, with estimates suggesting that billions of pounds of economic activity were being lost or postponed due to uncertainty. The tragedy was that these economic costs would be paid by ordinary workers and families who had no control over the political chaos but would suffer its consequences through job losses and reduced living standards. The international dimension involved not just the EU but also Britain's other major relationships. The United States was watching nervously as a key ally descended into political chaos that affected security cooperation and diplomatic coordination. Commonwealth countries were questioning whether Charles's actions in Britain would affect his role as their head of state and whether they needed to reconsider those constitutional arrangements. China and Russia were using British dysfunction as propaganda, pointing to it as evidence that Western democracy was failing. The soft power and international influence that Britain had maintained, despite no longer being a superpower, were being eroded by the perception of political instability and constitutional crisis. The historical parallels to other periods of constitutional crisis in British history offered some perspective but limited guidance. The conflicts between Crown and Parliament in the 17th century ended in civil war and eventually in firm establishment of parliamentary supremacy. The constitutional crises of the early 20th century around Irish Home Rule and the role of the House of Lords were resolved through political compromise and constitutional reform. But those precedents came from very different eras with different political cultures and challenges. Whether modern Britain could resolve its current crises through similar processes of compromise and reform, or whether the country faced more fundamental breakdown of constitutional consensus, remained an open and frightening question. The pressure on all parties to find some resolution was building because the status quo of constant crisis was unsustainable. Britain needed a functioning government that could make decisions and implement policies. It needed clarity about its constitutional arrangements and the respective roles of Crown, Parliament and government. It needed to resolve its relationship with the EU one way or another, rather than maintaining ambiguous arrangements that satisfied no one. The question was whether the political class had the wisdom and courage to find solutions, or whether events would continue to spiral beyond anyone's control toward outcomes that no one actually wanted, but that the logic of political combat made increasingly likely. The emergency parliamentary session called to address the multiple simultaneous crises was chaotic and revealed the depth of institutional breakdown. MPs from all parties demanded answers about the King's communications with the EU, about the Farage meeting and what had been discussed, about the government's plans for managing the constitutional crisis. Starmer's performance was widely described as his worst ever at the dispatch box. He appeared uncertain, defensive, unable to provide clear answers or articulate a coherent position. His usual precision and control had completely deserted him, replaced by rambling responses that satisfied no one and often contradicted previous statements. The opposition sensed weakness and attacked mercilessly, with calls for resignation coming not just from opposition benches, but increasingly from his own backbenches. The specific moment when Starmer's position became untenable came during questions about whether the King's EU communications had government approval. Starmer tried to maintain that the King's views were his own and didn't reflect government policy, while also insisting that there was no constitutional crisis and that Crown and government were working together appropriately. The contradiction was obvious, and MPs from all parties pounced on it. If the King's communications weren't government policy, then the monarch was acting against his government, which was a constitutional crisis. If they were government policy, then why hadn't Parliament been informed and consulted? Starmer's inability to answer coherently destroyed whatever credibility he had left. Senior MPs who'd been loyally defending him for months quietly concluded that he had to go.